Welcome everybody to the September North Houston Space Society meeting. My name is Nathan. I'm the president of the chapter, and I'm happy to tell you about the agenda. So I'll go over a few opening remarks, then we'll have Greg give us an update on recent space news. And then Dr. Amelia Greig will give us a talk on ablative arc mining for in-situ resource utilization. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And then we'll try to save some time at the end for you to share about your space experiences, and we could talk about some space-related meetings and activities coming up. And you know, you can share any of your personal experiences you want to share. And then at 4 p.m., we'll try to wrap everything up. So the vision of the National Space Society is people living and working and thriving communities beyond the Earth, and the use of vast resources of space for dramatic betterment of humanity. And I wanted to talk about the working piece of this, not necessarily in thriving communities beyond the Earth, but working inside of aerospace. So, you know, whenever people think about work in space, everybody thinks about an astronaut, of course. But there are actually a lot more careers than being an astronaut that deal with aerospace. And you know, why do we end up in the careers that we end up in? And I've been doing some thinking about this, and a very simplistic view is, you know, it really starts with all the possible careers that are out there. And then you're kind of limited by the careers that you know about, and then maybe further limited by the ones that you know the path to pursue. And then the ones that you think you can do, and then maybe ultimately the ones that you're encouraged and supported to actually go and pursue in high school and college and beyond. And you know, perhaps the ordering these Venn diagrams could be different, but the point is that you don't necessarily have the full scope of careers either in view or things that you can do. And what's even more interesting is this know about thing looks very you know, comprehensive, but in reality, you know, it's probably probably the careers that you know about are much smaller than the total number of careers that are out there, especially if you're in high school or college. And in aerospace, you know, you of course have astronauts and engineers, but you also have people that are combining like medicine with aerospace. And then, you know, these organizations are like any other organizations, and they have needs for accountants, security people. SpaceX even has a listing for barista and cook. So literally you could pursue any type of talent and still find a place for yourself in space. And I think that's one of the areas that chapters like ours can really play a role, is by essentially, you know, all these careers are out there and people have kind of a little bit of it that they know about. You know, perhaps in some ways we could kind of expand that circle a little bit for them and kind of encourage them to go to careers in an industry that's going to transform humanity and help them find really meaningful jobs. And there are hundreds of positions open today. You know, just looking at the SpaceX website, there are literally you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of jobs of all types and flavors. In fact, you know, there's a barista and catering lead and cook too, a senior tax accountant. They have to pay taxes too, and then of course sourcing materials and a whole bunch of other things. Blue Origin is looking for, you know, dozens and dozens of people. NanoRacks right here in Houston has a few job openings, and then Astrobotics up there in Pittsburgh. And Firefly, of course, is hiring dozens and dozens of people. I think a lot of people feel like that space is really science fiction or something philosophical or imaginary, but it's actually something that's very practical, and there is a need for all sorts of skills in space. And I think we help directly, you know, through our monthly meetings by providing a forum for people to kind of broaden their knowledge base, get to talk to each other, hopefully in person at some point, and actually see that there are resources around that can help them get a better idea on all the different careers and activities inside of the aerospace community. We also go on tours, so not only do you get to meet people, but you also get to touch real hardware. There in the back is the Bishop airlock before it was sent over to Kennedy Space Center to be launched on a Falcon 9 rocket to the ISS, and it's up there right now. So we got to go and tour that. So I welcome everybody to go to northhoustonspace.org, sign up for our email list, join the National Space Society. And this is a way to connect with other people that share this vision of humanity, really branching out into space. And we can all come together and educate and inspire communities about the benefits of this for humanity. So a few housekeeping things. This meeting is being recorded. We're going to put on our website, northhoustonspace.org, YouTube, Facebook, other places. And there's a couple of features about Zoom that I want to make sure you're familiar with. You can turn on and off your video. It might be nicer to have your video on, so at least we get a little bit of feel that we're in person, even though we're not. And there's also, you can mute and unmute your mic. If you're not speaking or during the presentations, it'd be good if you just stayed muted. During the Q&A session, we'll have time for to ask questions. There's a chat, so if you want to send some messages about talking, that could work. And then whenever it does come time to answer questions, there's this capability of raising your hand inside of Zoom. Down at the bottom of your screen, you should see this thing that says reactions, and then you can say raise your hand. What that'll do is indicate that you have a question to ask, and it actually puts you in order. It looks like, as an example, David has his hand up now. David, do you actually have a question?
I just had a comment to make on the discussion about careers. We have a lot of tendency to think about aerospace and space as synonymous, or aerospace as an industry and space. And really, when we start getting to where we're developing space, aerospace is just one industry that needs to be involved. I think we need to be considering space as a place to do business. We're going to need people that are in other industries and have experience from other industries like mining, which we might be talking about today, chemical processing, propellant processing, energy production, all those kinds of things, medical. And so there isn't really a whole lot of terrestrial industries that won't be needed. So just kind of want to make that point.
I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, especially like, food production and storage, and the ability to have, telemedicine is something that is, we need. And then, just everything about our lives will have to be adapted and expanded to work in space. So, I mean, that's even makes that picture of space-related jobs pretty much encompass the whole map. Well, and that worked out well that you asked the question there, because I got to demonstrate the whole raising and lowering of the hand. So that's good from that standpoint too. So on with our agenda. So now I'm going to pass it over to Greig. Greig has a PhD in chemical engineering. He's been doing our fantastic monthly space updates, and he's the vice president of the North Houston Space Society. And there's a lot more I could say about him, but it's on our website, and I encourage you to check it out. So with that, Greig, I'll send it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Give me a second to get set up here. Okay, does that give you the slideshow view here?
It looks good.
Okay, good. Give me a second. Okay. So we'll get started here with lunar news right off the bat. Sadly, this month is mostly stories about how not to get humans to the moon by 2024. The first one is SLS, which is a space launch system, the big rocket the NASA was behind originally. Their test flight is probably going to slip into next year. So they've had a series of schedule delays over the years. That one's not quite so surprising, but the other two are rather surprising, and I'll just jump right to what they are. The first one is spacesuits. The idea is to get humans to the moon by 2024. The Artemis program is doing that. And there has been a program underway really for quite a few years, since 2007, to make some new spacesuits to do that. And it really just comes down to 2 crew suits for the people on the moon and 1 suit for test use at the space station. And then, some prototyping before that. 420 million has been spent. The total program is about $1 billion, and it looks like it's falling behind. There's 27 different organizations involved in building parts for that versus 2 that were used for the space station. Now, what's wrong with what we have? Well, all we have right now are 45-year-old suits that were used in the space station. They're getting rather old. They're kind of restrictive. And the key thing is they're really not designed for long moonwalks. I mean, you don't have gravity at all in the space station. It's a little different kind of situation. And of course, dust is a concern too. And, this is not so much an issue on the space station. Now, SpaceX has some flight suits they use for the Crew Dragon, but that's really short-term protection against fire and, brief interludes in space. But that's not really intended for long duration outside use. Now, the Inspector General, which is a part of NASA, really, kind of an auditing function, they basically said, well, that's it. It turns out it's too late. It's not going to come done in time. We can't get there by 2024. Kind of a bad bureaucratic response. I mean, the correct response should be, oh my gosh, let's fix this. Well, that was what he said. But obviously what's going to happen is NASA is going to make amends on that. They're going to continue the work they have, but they're going to try to award some commercial contracts in 2022 also. Needless to say, Elon Musk had things to say about this, as he always does. Too many cooks in the kitchen, and then he did say that SpaceX could do it if need be. So chances are he'll be a bidder on, whatever contract is coming up soon from NASA. Now, the second thing that came up that was kind of out of the blue, so to speak, is Blue Origin's lawyers. A little background on this for everybody who hasn't been following it closely. The Artemis program basically sets up astronauts in a lunar orbit, and then they have a separate lander to go down to the surface called the Human Landing System, or HLS. And the budget was cut by Congress last year, and NASA ended up awarding a contract to SpaceX by itself for a variant of their Starship program. The original assumption had been there would be 2 contractors to maintain some competition, but there wasn't enough money left, so NASA went with 1. Blue Origin protested. The Government Accountability Office has rejected that protest, and Blue Origin even offered a $2 billion discount off of their price, which was still $1 billion higher than the SpaceX bid. But clearly they wanted to get back in. So now the next step is Blue Origin is actually suing NASA. And as a result, NASA had to halt the work. They had a court agreement that if the court would hear the thing, they would at least wait until November 1st to do any work under the contract. So it's essentially stopped it. And you could say it's kind of analogous to the way that Amazon filed suit against the Pentagon. They had a $10 billion contract out for IT infrastructure called JEDI. And all the rulings were really favoring Microsoft, but the whole thing was still tied up in court so long that finally the Pentagon just gave up. They just said they're not going to do it. And that it seems to be what they're trying to do here. Ironically enough, Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon and Blue Origin, he was back in 2019, he was comparing that time to the Apollo era, saying that, people are just suing the government when they lose, and that's not really right. Well, it turned out that was apparently more of a foreshadowing. We thought it was a complaint, and it turned out it was more foreshadowing. It really is costing a lot of goodwill for the company, which is not a good thing for Blue Origin because they really are just falling farther and farther behind SpaceX. I mean, they haven't, produced anything that can get to orbit yet. They are apparently suffering some brain drain. So this is not really a good look for Blue Origin anyway. Of course, Elon Musk had tweets about that too. he said if lobbying and lawyers could get you to orbit, Bezos would be on Pluto. And he also said that Bezos retired from Amazon basically to pursue a full-time career filing lawsuits. That's not 100% true, but anyway, that's the kind of stuff that's going on. But in it, one way or another, these programs are being delayed, and that does risk the 2024 original plan. Okay, moving on to Mars. Well, the Perseverance rover, that's been there now since summer, and it didn't succeed in getting its first sample. What happened is they drilled it. You can see it in this picture here. They drilled it, and apparently it was pretty powdery. Somehow or other, between drilling it and it up and storing it, it just crumbled away to dust and was lost completely. And this caused a lot of consternation at first. No one could really figure out how it happened because they thought there ought to be something. Now, of course, other theories arose as opposed to just having a dusty rock. I'll leave it to you to decide which is the correct explanation for why that sample disappeared. Meanwhile, they moved the rover to a different location. They looked for more solid rocks. They found this one. They've drilled it, and it appears that they have successfully taken the sample and stowed it away. So where is Perseverance, that rover, right now? And its helicopter. Remember, there's a helicopter that goes with it. So it went on a landing site. It's been moving around, on the surface. It had to go around a a field of sand dunes. They made good use of the helicopter. The helicopter could just fly right over that. And in fact, its pictures were what helped to decide that the rover really couldn't, go over those sand dunes. It was just too risky. They could get stuck. And so they've been making use of the helicopter to scout ahead. That's working out pretty well. Interesting that if you look at the distance driven by the rover now, it's been about 1.3 miles. The distance flown by the helicopter has been 1.66 miles. So they've actually gotten more distance covered out of the helicopter, which is just a very small add-on to the overall rover mission. But we shouldn't forget there are other rovers out there on the surface of Mars. There's two of them. One of them is a Chinese rover, and that's just completed its primary mission, which was 3 months. They've driven about a half a mile and taken samples, done a lot of the same kinds of things that the American rover had done. Then they, of course, will continue as long as they can, but at least they wanted to declare victory, just like we do. Usually after 3 months or so, we say we got everything we wanted, and now it's all gravy, and that's what's happened with them as well. Now, the other end of that is the Curiosity rover. That's been on the surface of Mars for 9 years. It's driven 16 miles, it's gone up 1,000 feet up a mountain. This is a view, it's really taken from a composite picture that they just released recently. It's very dramatic scenery over there because they're going up a mountain. So if you're interested in interesting mountain scenery, you might want to follow the Curiosity rover even more than the Perseverance rover. And of course, they have a map showing the path, but it's probably easier to see what's going on from these views. Now, the landing site for that lander, or that rover, was in a little blue circle right here. It's in an area called the Gale Crater. It's a big crater, and there's a mountain in that, which is kind of unusual. That's a fairly big mountain, about 18,000 feet. And they land there, and the idea was you want to survey for possible evidence of past biological life and just study the geology. So you want to go somewhere where you're way at the bottom, and then you can kind of go up in altitude, and you're seeing different sedimentary layers, different kinds of rocks. So you're seeing a lot of different things, and that's what's happened. So the picture down below shows a view. This was sort of toward the top of the mountain, but they figured out that these hills in the beginning here are basically a form of iron ore. There's some clays here, some sulfates, all kinds of things that they're seeing as they go up. Here they're showing the mission as they've been climbing up the mountain through the various different areas. And right now, they're pretty much at the end of this graph. This graph was made up a few years ago. Now, besides rovers, there's also a lander. The lander is the same thing, except it doesn't move around. It just goes in one place. This particular one was there to study the interior of Mars. So they're using seismic analysis in particular, and of course, just listening to local sounds, and they analyzed the magnetic fields. They were hoping to get a lot of information on heat flow, and of course, they tracked the weather. Now, this lander has been there for almost 3 years now, and some new recent papers came out as a result of some of the observations they've made. That in particular, the center of Mars is molten, but it's a lot there's a lot more there than was thought. The crust is a lot thinner, in other words. Now, they had some failures. The heat probe was supposed to go down 16 feet. They only managed to get 14 inches. It seems like it's just pretty hard to get samples on Mars. The other main problem they face is the panels are obscured about 8% by dust. I mean, this particular device is powered by solar panels, unlike the small nuclear-powered heat sources that are used on the other rovers. It's probably going to force the end of this mission in 2022 because as time goes on, at some point they won't be able to make it through the night when it gets so cold. The batteries won't have enough power to keep things warm. They've tried everything. They've tried various ways of shaking and vibrating things and trying to knock off the dust. They did find that if they use the robot arm to scoop up some of the sand, which is kind of coarse nearby, and just literally drop it on the solar panels, that helped. And that in fact has stretched out the life beyond what they thought they might be able to. But this is getting near the end of its life. Now, one thing, everything on Mars will stop communicating with Earth for a couple of weeks around October 7th. And that includes the rovers, the lander, the satellites around Mars for that matter. It includes the Chinese as well as the American ones. And the reason is simply that Earth and Mars are on the opposite sides of the sun, so you can't really transmit directly. Now, sometime in the future, we'll probably have relay satellites out at Lagrange points, and we'll be able to, see around the sun, but we don't have that right now. Now, this solar conjunction is what it's called. That occurs about every 2 years. So this is just, one part of living in space. There's things you don't really think about when you're on Earth, but, when you're in space, you have to worry about these things. Coming in a little closer to home, around Earth orbit kind of altitudes, let's talk about that. First one is, there were 2 resupply missions to the space station in August, the International Space Station, ISS. One of them was using the SpaceX Cargo Dragon, and the other was using the Northrop Grumman Cygnus and with their associated rockets. There are some significant differences in these, although obviously they had to meet some of the same specs for docking and so on. But docking is different. With the Dragon, it's fully automated. They just pretty much fly in directly and dock, and human intervention is not required. People obviously watch it, but it's not required. The Cygnus is a little different, and that's what's shown in the picture here. They have to grab the thing with the robot arm. You can see that's the one labeled Canada here because they built the robot arm. They have to grapple it and then pull it in and connect it up. So it's a much more labor-intensive operation, nothing automatic. This is a picture, of course, of that Cygnus spacecraft. And like all of these, what they do is they've all deployed solar panels because they need power from the time that they're launched into orbit to the time they finally dock. There's some other differences. Reuse. These the cargo dragons from SpaceX, they're reusable 5 times, and in between they splash down, and they have parachutes and they splash down into the ocean. Whereas the Cygnus, it just basically is thrown away and burns up in the atmosphere. So the payloads are different as well. The payload is rated as higher on the Cargo Dragon, although it hasn't really been tested yet. The highest delivery load ever delivered so far was, in fact, on the Cygnus. Earlier this year, they took up 8,400 pounds, and that's the maximum that's been demonstrated so far. But the big difference is on the return. You can return, things from the space station or from low Earth orbit back down to Earth. They call that down mass. And of course, because the Cygnus is disposable, basically all they can do is fill it up with trash, and just it gets burned up in the atmosphere along with the spacecraft itself. Now, this is significant if you think about it. Down mass is really the key. If you're going to have any kind of space manufacturing, whether it's hardware or whether it's hearts or biological things, whatever it is, if you're getting it back to Earth, you need a way to get it there. And right now, the Dragon is the only game in town on that. Originally, the space shuttle had the capability of bringing things back. Now, the Russian Soyuz capsule, they bring back people, but there's really not much room left for cargo. So if you want to bring back stuff, right now, the Cargo Dragon is the only choice. Now, there are a lot of programs going on with some of the smaller companies now, Momentus and some of the others, that are going to be building space tugs to move things around for collection, and then also have landers as well. The other thing going on in low Earth orbit is Starlight. It's time for an update on that. We've talked about it before, but this is the satellite-based internet service. It's really gotten pretty big at this point. They now have over 1,600 working satellites in orbit. 1,400 of them are operational. The difference is that the remaining couple hundred, they're up in orbit, but they're not in their final orbit yet, so they can't really be used as intended. It takes a while. It takes a couple of months for them to actually get to the final orbit. Now they've got a lot more users now. They have 100,000 beta test users, and that's in 12 countries. And it started off as just the northern altitudes. Now they also have all of New Zealand. So they've expanded quite a bit on that. And they have 500,000 pre-orders. These are people that are waiting for their chance to get the service. The speeds have held up. They're about 117 megabytes on the downlink. The time delays, it takes about 48 milliseconds for a ping. That's a two-way. So it indicates like 24 seconds time delay. So that's more or less as expected. They are getting subsidies from the government for rural service, as are a lot of terrestrial cable companies. Now, one business impact that has happened, though, excuse me, is that the investment that was going to be made by the people running the geosynchronous satellites, the ones up at 22,000 miles, the big ones, the traditional ones, that's pretty much dried up for internet use. They thought they could get into that, but they realized there's no hope competing against low Earth orbit. The problem is being up so high, the time delays are way too long to be useful for most things. The power requirements for two-way transmission really get in the way. So that's out of the picture. So already there's been an impact in the market. This picture here gives you an indication of the orbits. They're all at roughly 53 degrees versus the equator. So they're all kind of, just zooming around. The idea is that almost any spot on Earth should be covered by a nearby satellite. The picture is a little bit out of orbit because earlier this year, they had also done some polar orbits, that is orbits that go over the North and South Pole. The satellites themselves look like this. They just have one solar panel sticking out on one side. Now, if you take a step back, really SpaceX is kind of two bet the company sort of projects going on right now. And bet the company means they take a lot of upfront investment before there's any revenue. But both of these really do promise major disruptions. I mean, internet service everywhere, as well as Starship. So the two things are Starlink, which is what we're talking about. And that's $5 to $10 billion in investment before there's really positive cash flow. Probably maybe 30 billion investment long term, but once you get over that initial hurdle where you're getting money out returns, then it's easy to fund the rest of the investment. Starship, which is their huge rocket ship, that's their big investment. That's about a $5 billion investment there, and that may sound like a lot to normal people. But actually, you think about it, what does it cost to build a new semiconductor plant? Like the ones from Taiwan Semiconductor that we're trying to reproduce here in the U.S. You want to build one of those, it's $12 to $20 billion. So really, for the cost of one semiconductor plant, we could have worldwide internet service and Starship to drastically reduce the cost of space. A little bit more about the future of Starlink. They're about to start launching the version 1.5 satellites. And these are the ones that have the laser crosslinks. And we've talked about those before too. But the idea is, if you look at how communication has to happen in this lower right-hand diagram here, if you're a user, you would talk to the satellite. And without these crosslinks between satellites, you pretty much have to communicate either directly with a ground station and onto the internet, or directly to another user just within view of that same satellite. So that's pretty limited. But that's what they had mostly so far, except for the polar satellites they've just put up as tests. But all the future ones are going to have crosslinks so that a user could talk to a user going through a crosslink, never even having to go through a ground station, or they don't have to be close to a ground station. This makes a huge difference because it means that you really can have service in all kinds of remote regions, the Arctic, the middle of oceans, or hostile countries where you don't, maybe for one reason or another, you're not going to be able to have a ground station. So this will get past all that and really speed things up. There is a secondary benefit to these satellite crosslinks, and that is that the speed of light is a lot faster in a vacuum, as it's only two-thirds of that speed in optical fiber. So you do pick up a bit on actually maybe being able to do better than terrestrial-based internet communications. Now, there have not been any Starlink launches since May 15th. That's actually had an impact on the, the numbers of satellite or number of launches that you've seen in the last few months. And the reason is that they're upgrading all their satellites. So they changed over their manufacturing. It took them longer than they thought. So they're getting closer to being able to start launching again. The current phase, they've been authorized for about 4,400 satellites. Remember, they only have about 1,600 now. But the big issue coming up is a revision for the generation 2, and that's about 30,000 satellites. They're going to be bigger and have more power, and they've recently proposed changes to this, and they're even going to be able to carry small payloads. And we're going to talk a little later about a company called Swarm. There's been speculation that their stuff may be involved in this, because SpaceX is buying them. The altitudes are both lower or higher. They're not all going to be the current 340 miles, and they'll be in more different orbital planes, including some sun-synchronous ones, which is interesting. Sun-synchronous means that at a given time of the day, the same satellite is over the same place. And that actually will help them for peak demands. If they know areas have peak demands, they can make sure to place more satellites overhead. So they're working those kinds of issues. The big thing coming up is that with Starship, once that's available, it's a much bigger rocket. It can take up 400 satellites at a time, as opposed to the 60 that we have now. And they also will be able to take them directly to the desired orbit, instead of going through the low orbits and then taking a few months to get to the final orbit. Why are they doing this? They're expecting 10 times the revenue they can get from the launch business. Starlink is basically the global business for space. For the most part, it is satellites when you get down to it. It's the services provided by them that generate the money, not the launch so much itself. So they're hoping for maybe $30 billion a year in revenue. And here's where Blue Origin orders are coming in again. Because Starship isn't ready yet, but they want to be able to launch on Starship, SpaceX put in 2 alternatives in their revised proposal. Based on whether or not Starship is ready, they'll fall back to Falcon 9 like they're using now. Starship is not ready. But the Blue Origin people are saying, no, that's too many proposals. You shouldn't approve this. So wrangling is occurring. There is competition. OneWeb we've talked about before. They now have 288 satellites up there. They're focused more on business customers than individuals. They're up higher, which has good and bad points. The good point is they can see, each satellite can see more of the Earth because of the curvature of the Earth. But the bad, so they don't need so many satellites. The bad side, though, is it takes more power to reach the further distance, and there's bigger time delays. The other constellations really are not very far along yet, so there's not much serious competition. Now, this does raise issues about Iridium, though, which is really the pioneer in these large satellite constellations for communications. They're not really a competitor right now. They have 2 main businesses. One of them is essentially cell phone service, except it's by satellite, some handheld devices. But the other is they do have an Internet of Things business. That is low-speed, low-power internet. For instance, for people tracking trucks and ships, they even track whales using Iridium. When a whale surfaces, there's a transmission up to the nearest satellite to tell it, location. SpaceX apparently wants a piece of this business, which they can't really address, with their larger satellites. They're actually went out and they bought a company called Swarm. And this may be the first acquisition by SpaceX. So it's pretty unusual that they actually think there's a company out there that had interesting enough technology. And I think it is. You could say this is a kind of a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids kind of a setup here, except it's a Starlink system. It looks like it in a lot of ways, it's just a whole lot smaller. Right now, they have about 150 small satellites. And by small, I mean really small. We've been thinking of CubeSats, which are 3-inch cubes, as being small satellites. Well, not anymore. This is a quarter the size of a CubeSat. They weigh less than a pound at 400 grams. They look like this. This is the CEO holding one of the satellites in her hands here. And they can be launched in flat packs, a lot like the way the SpaceX has flat packs for launching their satellites. But again, these are much, much smaller. It's interesting they call them sandwich size. For some reason, they always specifically say grilled cheese sandwich. I don't know why that is. Maybe they're implying something by that. I think they just like cheese. Anyway, they have the 150 satellites up already, 40 ground stations in 2020. I didn't see a figure for this year. And they've been selling their service since February. The nature of their service is that they don't have to have a full constellation. And the reason is, it's kind of down here at the bottom of the slide. It's called a store and forward network. What happens is they transmit up when there's a satellite there, and if there's no ground station to transmit it back to the ultimate user, they just wait and it holds it and transmits it. So they can't do, telephone service or video streaming or any of that. What they're doing essentially is text messages and delayed text messages, but with very low power. The devices that transmit up cost $119. It's called the Swarm Tile. There's a picture of that here. And again, you can see somebody's hand for comparison. So we're talking about something much, much smaller, than the current SpaceX, ground terminals. And it costs $36 million to get this whole thing up there. So it's, pretty much a shoestring kind of an operation. So it's aimed at the small devices, the Internet of Things. Basically things like tracking trucks. I put one of these on each truck, ships, buoys, that sort of thing. And the other big application they're seeing is relaying sensor data. So in agriculture in particular, you can scatter around various sensors to monitor rainfall and temperatures and so on. And each one of them would have one of these little swarm tiles. They could transmit, say, once an hour. And, as long as you don't need the data right away, you can use that. Their data rate is only 5 kilobits a second, so it's quite small. But that's good enough for a lot of these applications. The key thing here is it's cheap. $5 a month. You get one of these tiles, you can transmit one message, which is 192 bytes, just like your SMS text messages. That's $5 a month, which means that they beat Iridium substantially. Iridium costs 4 to 20 times as much for the same kind of service. So it's a very drastic difference. So it'll be interesting to see what SpaceX really does with this. And that brings us now to the question, how many launches do you think we've had since the last meeting, which was August 7th? And as a reminder, this includes failed launches. So as long as you tried to get to orbit or beyond, we count it. So for instance, this picture that we had here, this was an Indian rocket liftoff. And it got up about 87 miles and the third stage failed. So the overall rocket was a failure, but it counts as a launch. So everybody, you should have a screen up there to say, what's your best guess on how many launches there have been since August 7th? So slightly less than a month. And just give you a few more minutes. I'm probably going to be running over here, so trying to get through it quickly. Okay, so it looks like 3 people said 10, 2 people said 9, some people said 8, a few said 6, a few said less than 5. Well, it turns out the right answer is, I'm trying to get rid of this. The right answer is 10. Now we've already talked about some of these launches, like the cargo ships to the space station. One interesting one is that the Chinese sent up a couple test satellites, possibly for setting up a network like Starlink. They may end up becoming a competitor for that. They have said they're interested in doing it, and they're starting to put the launches in place to test it out. There were a couple notable failures in here. Astra is a new space company. They've been trying to get to orbit. They've almost made it. This was their third try. They didn't quite make it. But it was probably the most dramatic failure I've seen in quite a while. You might want to check out the video on this one. One of their engines failed right away. They may have had a problem. They bumped into the launch stand or something. But anyway, one engine went out and the rocket started tipping over, and then the control system kicked in to correct it. But the problem is, with one engine out, they basically just had enough power to hover, at least with the initial weight. So it kind of just drifted sideways for a while. And then after a while, when some of the fuel got used up, then that thrust started actually overpowering the weight and it started to go up. But finally, it got up some number of miles and they blew it up. Firefly Alpha, that's their very first attempt at an orbital test flight did fail, unfortunately. Now, some other interesting things that have happened is COVID-19 is still taking a toll, directly and indirectly. The schedules for SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, and others are now at risk because there's a shortage of liquid oxygen. And the reason is that there's so much oxygen needed in hospitals right now. Now, there's other uses for liquid oxygen. It's used in some water treatment, for instance. And there have been people trying to cut back on the water treatment so that they can have that oxygen freed up for use in hospitals. And it had a kind of a secondary effect where some of the trucks that they were using to transport the liquid nitrogen, they've converted over to using oxygen instead so they can get it more to the hospitals. And now there's also have a liquid nitrogen shortage. And that did delay already a satellite launch as well. Nitrogen is used for testing, printing, and some other purposes. And then, kind of related to this somewhat indirectly, there's still the global semiconductor shortage. This is starting to delay space business as well. In particular, it's been highlighted by SpaceX as impacting their ability to build the ground terminals for Starlink. Gwen Shotwell of SpaceX was the one who also was probably really highlighting this news to everybody about the liquid oxygen shortage as well. We'll take time for a few brief questions or discussion items before we move on to introducing the main speaker.
So one thing, Greg, wasn't that Swarm, didn't they have an issue a few years back with like the FCC and launching an unlicensed
Yeah, they sure did. Yeah, it's amazing they managed to recover from that. What happened is their first 4 satellites, they never got approval from anyone. They sent them up, actually, they sent them up in an Indian rocket. Then it turned out that the Indians never really asked, it was a don't ask, don't tell kind of situation. They never really asked about it. They found out and they got, they found out the FCC really complained, and so now they're being much more careful about it. But they were fined $900,000 for that. And then there was a settlement where they got the $900,000 had to be paid to the government. And then a week later, they announced their new plans and put in a new proposal, and they pretty much got accepted pretty quickly. They said they corrected the problems, they apologized profusely, and went on. But yeah, they were kind of the bad boys, not following the rules. Okay, well, probably should move on to introducing our main speaker, Amelia Greig. Now, she is an assistant in aerospace and mechanical engineering at University of Texas, El Paso. She leads electric propulsion and small satellite programs. And her interest obviously is in plasma technologies. That's what her PhD is in, where she got that from the Australian National University. And she's worked in several other, prominent universities, including Caltech, where she was a postdoc. Has degrees in mechanical and aerospace engineering and in theoretical physics. And she also is a NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Fellow. What that means is she got a grant, phase 1 funding to research harvesting lunar water. She's giving a talk, in fact. NAIC is having a conference coming up fairly soon here, and she'll be speaking at that as well. So you may be hearing this first here. So her topic is talking about arc mining for in-situ resource utilization. Now, we've talked about that many times, that that's really a key for sustainable expansion into space. You've got to make use of resources on places like the moon. It's just too expensive to move stuff to the moon or Mars. You really got to start living off the land. And so NASA had put up a contract for getting water, and she came back with a much more radical idea of using electric arcs and basically get multiple materials at once. You turn them into plasma, you collect them and use magnets to separate them and collect different elements like nickel and I guess silicon as well as water. So at that, I'll turn it over to Amelia.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I will be presenting at the NIAC Symposium, which is at the end of, or towards the end of September. And yes, it will be on the same topic. So you are indeed getting a bit of a sneak preview today, which is very exciting. So let me share the presentation with you all. You can all see that now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at your meeting. I remember I met Bobby about a year ago, September last year, at another virtual networking event, and he was telling me about the meetings you hold and put me in touch with Nathan, and I was very happy that I was able to work with Nathan to be able to set up a time to speak with you. So Yeah, today I'd like to talk to you about this new concept that I have for in-situ resource utilization, or basically mining the moon, where indeed I use electric arcs to try to extract some of the different materials from the surface of the moon. Before I do that, I thought I'd introduce myself a little bit, just so you know who this person talking to you through your computer is. So I'm actually from a place called Tasmania originally. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a state of Australia. It's the state that's its own little island underneath mainland Australia. So it's kind of the land down under, down under. It's an absolutely gorgeous place. The middle of it is filled with beautiful mountains. All around the edges is just stunning coastline. And then everywhere in between, it's very rural. So there's lots and lots of beautiful green farmland everywhere. So, so we have some famous exports from Tasmania you might know. Going back a while, but Errol Flynn, famous Tasmanian. If you're into, if you watch the Olympics swimming at all, you might have seen there was a great rivalry this year between Katie Ledecky and an Australian swimmer called Ariana Titmus. She's actually from Tasmania as well, so very proud of her. And then of course, there's Tasmanian Devil. Everyone knows Tasmanian Devil. But what you might not know is that they actually look absolutely nothing like the cartoons whatsoever. So they're more like little cats, more like the size and look of a really fierce little cat rather than some crazy dog. But anyway, the cartoon's great. I love the cartoon. I just feel like it's my responsibility as a Tasmanian to let you know what they really look like if you've never seen one before. So how did this little kid from a rural state in Australia end up now living in Texas and building technologies to mine the moon? It's quite, it's a short story so far. I'm hoping it gets a lot longer as we go on. But as I mentioned, Tasmania is a very rural place. I was very fortunate growing up. My family lived right on the beach. One set of my grandparents lived just a few minutes away, also right on the beach. And then my other set of grandparents had a dairy farm. So I got to spend my time at the beach and then on a farm hanging out with cows. And when I wasn't doing that, I'd be at home watching science fiction movies with my dad, or stargazing, satellite spotting, trying to spot the space station flying overhead in the beautiful dark skies that Tasmania has. So fell in love with space very early on. When I was a little bit older, my family moved to mainland Australia, actually to the capital city. It's called Canberra. It's a lot like Washington, DC in many ways. It's very much designed to be the capital. It's a planned city. So it's got defense and politicians all very nicely organized, except it's a triangle instead of a straight line. And so we spent a lot of time at the Defense Force Open Days and visiting different military events. And so all through school, I was absolutely convinced I was going to be a helicopter engineer in the Navy. But circumstances made that not work out for me. And so I went off and I studied aerospace engineering at the University of Adelaide. While I was there, I read this magazine, which kind of changed everything. The article was called 39 Days to Mars, and I am a complete Mars nerd. So I want to go live there. Basically, that's how much of a Mars nerd I am. And so I read this article, and it's all about the Vasimir rocket, which being based in Houston, some of you probably know quite a lot about. Very, very exciting technology. So that got me interested in electric propulsion. Right, so that's how I ended up at the Australian National University with the Space Plasma Power and Propulsion Group doing electric propulsion research. Not quite an engine the size of Vasimir that would get us to Mars. I worked on a little engine called Pocket Rocket. It's designed for small satellites, so it's a lot smaller, but it's still electric propulsion and still really, really interesting. So after I finished there, I went off. I did spend a year at Caltech doing a postdoc in plasma physics, but very early into that, I got the opportunity to go to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, which is the home of the CubeSat. So they are that's the location, the place where the CubeSat standard, these little cubic satellites that have become so popular, were first thought of and invented, and they still maintain the international standard. So it was very exciting to be able to go work with them. I spent 3 years there as an assistant professor trying to build up integrating micropropulsion devices into these small satellites so they work better, more reliably. There's more of a connection between the propulsion developers and the satellite developers. So that was great fun. But after about 3 years of being there, I met a guy at a conference. His name is Dr. Hassan Chuduri. He's from University of Texas at El Paso. And he was telling me about the Aerospace Center that they have there and all the amazing things that they do and all the facilities that they have and the kind of vision that they have. So they invited me down there for a seminar. And I went and I just absolutely fell in love with the place. And so they offered me a job as an assistant professor there. I could switch across and I decided to go for it. And I loved Cal Poly, but I'm very happy I made the switch over. UTEP's a really amazing place to be. So originally I was brought there to do the electric propulsion and small satellite programs for them. But pretty much as soon as I arrived, an opportunity came up to do lunar mining or more lunar exploration technologies. And so I just kind of fell into that part of it and absolutely love it and wouldn't change it for the world. So, and that is, so that's how I ended up working in lunar mining. And then as it was mentioned, this year, I was honored to be named a NIAC fellow for my arc mining idea. And so currently getting support to develop that through the NASA NIAC program. All right, so before I get on to the actual arc mining stuff, I just wanted to go over a little bit about UTEP and the Aerospace Center, because although El Paso is in Texas, we are in the same state, but technically I think Los Angeles is actually closer to El Paso than Houston is. And so it's highly probable that you may not have ever found a need to come over this way or found yourself over in the El Paso region. So it's a nice town or city, I should say. It's there right on the border of Mexico and New Mexico. So as you can imagine, really great food around this area. The university itself, we're in the UT system, about 25,000 students in total. But what's really unique about UTEP, we have 83% of our students are Hispanic, and of the whole population of the school, about 50% are actually the first in their families to ever attend college, which in the 21st century, like 2021, that's still a very rare thing that there's so many first generation college students. So we were recently named as an R1 university under the Carnegie classification about 2 years ago. And we're currently ranked number 5 in Texas for research after UT Austin, Texas A&M, University of Houston, of course, and then UT Dallas. So we kind of get hidden a little bit because we're a bit remote, but it's actually a very, very active and very, very great school. My favorite thing about it is the fact that the El Paso region traditionally is not the highest socioeconomic region in America. And so like I said, a lot of our students are first generation. And so we are ranked very high in student social mobility. So we are one of the most highly ranked schools in the whole United States for helping students go from like the bottom 20% of family income to the top 20% of family income. And especially in the STEM fields, we are one of the major schools to inject underrepresented minorities into all the different STEM career options. So it's a very, very exciting place to be a part of. So my work there all goes through the UTEP Aerospace Center, which is also sometimes known as CSETA, Center for Space Exploration and Technology Research. So the reason for the acronym that doesn't match the name is the fact that we started off as CSETA many, many years ago, where it really was just space exploration technologies. But since then, it has expanded to the point where we do so much more than that. And so keeping the CSETA name by itself didn't make sense. So it's now Aerospace Center with CSETA as part of it. Right. So we've been around about 12-ish years formally as the center. And in that time, graduated 250 students through the different levels, and sticking with the UTEP traditions, about 77% are Hispanic. So again, really injecting a lot of underrepresented minorities into the technical workforce. At the moment, we have 35,000 square feet of lab space, which includes 8,000 acres of test facilities, plus 8,000 acres of test facilities, which includes 2 airports, because 1 is just not enough. You've got to have 2. And then, like I mentioned, we have a really broad research portfolio unmanned aerial systems, energy, propulsion, hypersonics, space, and so much more. So it's a really, really exciting place to be a part of. So this is where we've kind of come from. It's developed very, very fast. Started in 2009 just as a university research center with about 30 students per year. And over time, we got an injection of funding from NASA under the MIRO program, Minority Institution Research Opportunities. And so they gave us significant amount of funding to expand. And then the UT system has just awarded us another big capacity development grant to allow us to expand. We're now actually at 160 students per year. And the plan is we're going to keep expanding. We're going to get to over 600 students within the next 5 years. And that's per year, not total. Right? So very big expansion, very exciting place to be. These are our current partners right now, just to give you an idea of who we work with and what we do a little bit. So we work with a lot of other institutes as well. Research universities, two-year institutions, right? Federal labs, aerospace and defense industry. We have Blue Origin just down the road from us, just a couple of hours to the east is Blue Origin's launch site. Just a couple of hours to the north is Virgin Galactic, Spaceport America's launch site. So we're kind of right in the center of a lot of that commercial spaceflight aspect. And then we have very close relationships with quite a lot of the NASA centers, including Johnson Space Center in Houston, which is where we do, which is our main collaborator for the lunar exploration programs. Right. So as I mentioned, very broad range of research projects we've got going on. Started as a chemical propulsion research center with combustion studies. Since then, we've added space systems, unmanned aerial systems, hypersonics research, which more relates to materials and structures to be able to withstand the extreme environments that you see in hypersonic flight. A lot of energy research, electric propulsion, which is the one that I was asked to come there and add, and then lunar exploration, which is of course the one that I'm going to be focusing on talking about today. But before I do get into the lunar, I just want to go a little bit over some of the other parts because they may not seem like they fit in with the lunar exploration, but it is actually all interlinked with us. So first of all, our space systems. We've been developing small spacecraft, small satellites, little 10 centimeter CubeSats for about 5 years. Our first one reached orbit in January of 2020, and we were able to hear from it and communicate with it. So that was very, very exciting for us. And now we are working on moving forward with different space system technologies for on-orbit manufacturing, robotics, and machine learning for the smart satellites of the future. And the reason I mention this is we are not only looking at how to get materials from the lunar surface, we are also then looking at how we could potentially use them to manufacture things in space while we are in orbit around the moon, rather than having to make big structures on the surface and then try to figure out how to launch a massive structure. You can print it and make it in space, which makes it a lot easier for everyone involved. Right, a lot of propulsion focus at the Aerospace Center. We have small satellite propulsion and then all the way up to big Methalox rockets. So for the small satellite propulsion, what we are focusing on right now is developing enough technologies that we could use to put university-built satellites in orbit around the moon to do science or help with communications or whatever else needs to happen around the moon to support future crewed missions and lunar exploration. So we have green mono propellant thrusters where we develop our own catalyst for them and design the actual thrusters themselves. We have cold gas and we have the electric propulsion. We do ambient and vacuum testing. And then as I mentioned right now, we are looking at putting them into satellites, particularly with a lunar exploration focus to be able to get us better information about where on the moon we should be exploring, mining, looking at, etc. Right. And then the final one, which really does relate to the lunar mining, is our cryogenic propulsion. This actually started before we did the lunar mining aspect, but this is part of the reason why we decided to move into the mining as well. So we were developing Methalox, liquid oxygen, liquid methane rockets. and thrusters to be able to enable us to build a lunar lander. So to go down, bring a 200-pound payload down from the lunar gateway onto the surface and then take it whatever back up again afterwards. And so we're focusing on methalox originally, or to start with, we're focusing on methalox because they are common propellants that we think we can get from other planets, more so Mars than the moon, of course, but at least you can sort of get them there, or you get oxygen as a starting point. We will move into liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen eventually. We just wanted to start with the methalox. It's a little bit smaller, compact, and somewhat safer system to handle. So we do the design of the engines and the lander that it goes with them. And then we use one of those airports that we have to do the testing. So we have at the moment a horizontal test stand that can do up to 2,000 pounds force rocket engine testing. We're looking to expand that to go into higher thrust and a vertical test stand as well. That's part of the future expansion plans. Right, so moving into more of the lunar exploration stuff, like I said, there's a lot of overlap. I borrowed this figure from that was put out by NASA a couple of years ago now, all the things that we need technology-wise to be able to expand first to the moon and then on to Mars, right? And so the ones with the yellow boxes around them are the ones that we are looking at in the UTEP Aerospace Center right now. So I already directly mentioned some of them. In space assembly and manufacturing, our advanced propulsion like the electric and the methalox, extreme environments, testing a lot of materials and structures for extreme environments, right? And then of course, autonomy, cryogenic fluid management, right? And then in-situ resource utilization is right there. Okay, and that's going to be the focus for the rest of today's presentation. So it was just a general overview, a bit more of like what we're doing over there in West Texas and how we ended up in doing ISRU. Right. So here is a very nice picture of the moon. Right? It's taken on the Apollo 16 missions. Really not much there, right? If you look at it here, how could humans possibly ever live somewhere like that? And that's true, that's a really big challenge. How could we ever possibly live somewhere like that? There's two options. Take everything you need with you, as if like you're going hiking in a desert, just take everything you need. Or you get creative and figure out how to use what's there and make the best of it. Taking everything there, not really practical given the long distances that you have to go and how heavy everything is. So we need to figure out ways to enable the use of local lunar, Martian or asteroid resources to be able to support future human exploration missions, future human settlements. And so when I look at this picture now, I don't see just a nice moonscape of rock. I see places where there potentially we might be able to squeeze out some water from those rocks, and where we might be able to get oxygen out of there, and metals and silicon for electronics, building materials for settlements and habitats. Right. So through advanced technologies, we have a lot better chance of actually being able to use local resources to support our future missions. So one of the really big ones, humans need water and oxygen to survive, right? A lot of the other stuff like propellants would be nice to have, but you're not gonna, it's just nice to have, right? Humans need water, we need oxygen, there's no way around that. We can't get by without them. So of course, water is one of the main focuses for the early missions, early mining techniques, right? And so there has been a few missions now over the past decade or two that have confirmed there is indeed water available on the surface of the moon, not necessarily in giant lakes and ice sheets like we see on the Earth, but little pockets of ice either embedded into the rock or like deeper layers underneath some of the regolith. So it's always focused in the regions where it doesn't see much sunlight, so it's very cold. The moon, it looks barren, but it's actually very hot if you're in the sun. And so any water on the surface, because there's no atmosphere, as soon as the sunlight hits it, any water in that area is going to start sublimating off and it's going to be lost. So really the water only exists in permanently shadowed regions that very rarely, if ever, see the sun. And so it's very, very cold and it's frozen in. So most of that concentrates around the South Pole region. In these figures, the blue dots are where it's been confirmed or measured that there is water through satellite measurements. And then there's a little bit on the North Pole, but not as much. So we're very much focusing on the South Pole crater regions right now of where we can get the water from. So now we know it's there. We know we need it. We just got to figure out how to get it out. When we do mining on the Earth, we very much just mostly do excavation at this point. There are some more advanced technologies coming in, but really it's just you find a place where there's minerals and you dig and you extract them and you get them out. So excavation type mining that we're all familiar with, you need really heavy machinery, significant amount of moving parts. And this is fine for the Earth, right? Obviously we designed these technologies to work on the Earth and that's what they're designed for and that's what they do. But if we just tried to transplant the same idea to the moon, it's not going to work at all. It's a much colder environment. So a lot of the electronics are very susceptible to that. And even the moving parts, you know, when it's really, really cold. So even some of those become an issue. It's very, very high vacuum and there's reduced gravity as well. And then there's that lunar dust, it just gets everywhere. It's very fine powder, it gets in everywhere, it's electrostatic, so it just sticks to everything and you really can't get rid of it. So current mining techniques that we use on the Earth, just not going to be completely transplantable to the moon. So one of the main techniques that's been the focus instead for the past many, many years now is called thermal mining. And so that is where you add heat directly to the regolith. When I say regolith, I mean like lunar soil, lunar rock mix, right? Just basically the surface of the moon. So you add heat directly to it. Then any water that is either on the rock or embedded in the rock is going to sublimate off, which is the low pressure equivalent of evaporation. So it just goes straight from the solid phase to the vapor phase. And so because of the low temperatures that you can do that at, thermal mining is very useful for water. You can get water out of the frozen regolith very sort of easily, I guess, using this technique, relatively easily, meaning how easy can something be on the moon anyway? And there's been some really creative ideas from a whole bunch of different people that it's really great to see about where this heat source can come from, right? So one is direct sunlight. Sunlight, as soon as it hits the lunar regolith, is going to start sublimating everything naturally. But the problem is the water is hidden in places that never naturally see the sunlight. So there have been proposals for big mirrors and solar concentrators that essentially redirect the sunlight down into these regions that never see the sun so that the water starts to sublimate off and you can collect it. There's also ideas that are somewhat a hybrid between excavation and thermal, where you have a drill, but you heat it first. So as you put it into the soil, it's more that the heat that it's producing is going to be evaporating and sublimating the water. OJ dryers are very similar. They're like a screw that you pass the regolith through, so it doesn't go into the soil. You kind of pull the regolith away from the ground. And again, you're just heating it as it moves through this screw so you can release the water. And then another really interesting concept is microwave energy. So we're all familiar with microwaves in our house, right? They have that 21 centimeter wavelength to heat up water, right? And so why not just put that kind of microwave energy across the surface of the regolith to target the water specifically, heat it up to the point it then starts sublimating. Right, so these are the main techniques that people are using right now, and it's very promising. Like these techniques are great, right? Of course, there's still a huge amount of challenges with them. First of all, the water is in these permanently shadowed regions. It's really cold, it's really dark. So some of these techniques still need the moving parts. They need a lot of power. Being dark, we can't rely on sunlight. And a lot of space technology use solar, of course. So that makes getting power to the system very, very challenging. I've mentioned that moon dust. Lunar dust, it sticks to absolutely everything, just wreaks havoc, but there's no way getting around that right now. But more for the thermal mining aspect. Once you sublimate this vapor off the regolith or out of the regolith, it's such a low pressure environment that it just starts going everywhere. There's no pressure driven flows like we're used to seeing on the Earth, where you can kind of use a high pressure and a low pressure to push gases and vapors and liquids one way or the other. So on the moon's surface, you might not necessarily have enough vapor coming off to be able to do that. And so it's just going everywhere and you can't control it. So you lose a lot. Secondly, if you try to use thermal mining techniques for anything that's not water, like anything with a higher melting point, then you need to add a lot of energy, especially think like metals. You need to get temperatures of above 1,000 degrees to be able to start melting down metals to be able to then potentially extract them. So a lot of these thermal mining concepts just focus on water, which for the moment, as that is the main focus, is perfectly fine, right? But it would be nice if we could think about doing some techniques that can also simultaneously collect non-water volatiles like silicon, like the metals, like pure oxygen, etc. Right. So when I started working in the lunar exploration, lunar mining field, ISRU field, and I started learning about these challenges, the one that stood out to me the most was that natural diffusion of low pressure particles and just losing so much of the vapor because we can't control where it goes. And the reason it stood out to me is that I have a background in electric propulsion, and that's basically what we do, is controlling low pressure particles. That's what electric propulsion is. You create charged particles in a really low pressure environment, so then you can accelerate them with electric and magnetic fields. So I was wondering, why don't we, as the water vapor comes off the surface of the moon, ionize it, turn it into charged particles instead of just being neutral water vapor. That way, instead of allowing it to naturally diffuse everywhere, you can put it through an electric field and it will all be sort of forced to go one direction. And so you can move it towards a collector for your water vapor or whatever it is you're trying to collect, right? So this little diagram sort of shows that you have your regolith, you're still doing the standard thermal heating, thermal mining, right? You just add that electron source so that as the neutral water vapor comes off, electrons will hit the neutral water, turn it into water ions. Now that they're charged, they're going to move through the electric field towards the negative end. So you just make your vapor collection area negatively charged relative to where the regolith is coming off the ground, and all your water should, in theory, move that way, and you get increased collection rates. So there's a few extra benefits for this that we've developed or sort of discovered, realized as we've been working through it with the folks at JSC. And one of the ones that really stood out was that not only can you potentially increase the amount of water that's being collected, you can kind of purify it on the way. So we are trying to sublimate just water, but of course, as it comes off the regolith, it's going to have impurities in it, all sorts of different impurities. A lot of them can be filtered out at the other end where we recondense the water vapor and try to turn it back into ice, because it has very different solidification points. And so you can kind of just control the temperature of the collector to mostly just get out the water, and everything else stays in the vapor phase. But one of the ones that's really tricky is mercury. We're going to have mercury impurities in the vapor that comes off. It's got pretty much the same solidification point as water, so we can't remove it at the condenser. And then of course, mercury is just really awful. You don't want mercury in your water, especially if we're going to use it for astronauts to drink, right? So trying to get that out is going to be a very hard and complex problem, but it's possible. We haven't really looked too much into this one through experiments yet, but we will, that by using or expanding on this ion transport, by adding a magnetic field, we might be able to actually filter the mercury out at the very early stages of the extraction process. So everything's the same. You still sublimate, you've got neutral water vapor and maybe some mercury and other impurities coming in. You ionize them all with the electrons, start moving them in the electric field, but then you add this permanent magnet. And so when a charged particle moves through a magnetic field, it's going to curve. The trajectory just naturally curves. And the rate of curvature depends on the mass of the particle. So water is very light. Light molecule, it's going to curve a lot. mercury is very heavy compared to water. It's not really going to curve that much at all. So potentially we might be able to set it up where we just move the collector to the side, curve the water into it, and then the mercury just continues on sort of past the side into like a waste bucket or something like that. So this is sort of something new that only came up a couple of months ago as we're working on it. So looking at this more now, but we think it's very promising as well. Right. So that was the initial thoughts I had, my electric propulsion brain going, hey, why don't we use some electric propulsion techniques to try to help the lunar mining? And as that evolved over a couple of months, it got more advanced and more advanced. And I thought we could add on like more electric propulsion techniques to make it even better, potentially better, I should say. It's still very much under investigation, but in theory, it's good. And so part of that is thermally sublimating stuff. It takes a lot of energy. I said at the moment, you can really only do it with water. So there's some limitations on that end of it. So I thought, why don't we use an electric arc instead of just trying to heat up the regolith and sublimate the water off by putting an electric arc, which when I say that, if you're not familiar, it's basically putting lightning across the surface of the moon. It's just a bolt of a lot of really high energy electron particles that are going to hit everything along the way and just spray, ablate stuff off and then ionize it on the way. So it comes off as a charged particle rather than like neutral particle, right? So if we put an electric arc across the surface of the regolith, we're going to be ablating off any constituent, any volatile that's in the regolith, not just water. So water will still come off, pure oxygen will come off, there'll be silicon, carbon, magnesium, aluminum, all the elements that you find in the lunar regolith will be coming off, and they will be coming off, majority of them in charged form, so already as ions. So now we don't need that second electron source. It's all just sort of been combined. The extraction, the heating, and the ionizing has been combined into one electric arc, right? And so now we have our charged particles. We can go back pretty much to the same ion transport method that I was just going over. So you can use an electric field to try to direct the particles from the lunar soil to whatever collection unit you have. So ready to then collect and sort, right? And this minimizes the losses from that low pressure rarefied diffusion flow from everything. So yeah, we have our particles, they're heading into our collector. We then pass them through something called ion optics, which is a series of, well, it's pretty much, it's like linear, it's like light optics, but for particles, charged particles instead of photons, right? So you pass them through a series of different electric fields and gates and apertures of, and it can kind of focus them down into a very uniform collimated beam that's all going the same velocity, right? And that's called ion optics. So once you've got that collimated uniform ion beam, you can then pass it through the magnetic field. As I sort of touched on before, when you pass charged particles through a magnetic field, they're going to curve. The curve is actually related to two things. One of them is mass, like I mentioned. The second one is velocity, which is why you have the ion optics first, to get them all to exactly the same speed. Then when you pass them through the magnetic field, the only thing that differentiates the curve of their path is their mass. So you can sort them by element type, like water is going to, again, curve a lot. Magnesium and aluminum and some of the heavier, well, I guess not even, they're not that heavy, but some of the heavier elements and the metals won't curve as much. And so you can then put dedicated collection reservoirs into the path of the curve for whatever particular element you're trying to collect. And then you can make the collection reservoirs targeted for the element, of course, as well. So water, at the moment, we're just focusing on cold traps. It's basically just trying to refreeze the water into ice to collect it. If you're trying to collect, say, more gaseous like carbon dioxide, there's a substance called zeolite, which absorbs carbon dioxide very readily when it gets cold. So you can kind of just pull it in and trap it in the reservoir that way. For metals, you just kind of sputter them across a surface and just put a sheet of metal, another kind of metal there. And you'll end up with like a layer of nickel, which you can then just scrape off later and use. So yeah, the collection reservoirs change based on the element. And then this whole system is contained in a single mobile surface crawler. So it's small enough and compact enough that this can all sit in basically one rover, a large rover, like I think a mining truck versus a car, right? But it all fits in one system, and then you can drive it around the lunar South Pole regions and start mining. And so some of these concepts, depending on your backgrounds and what you've seen, some of these concepts might seem a little bit out there, but I want to point out every single aspect of this has been developed before for a different purpose. All I'm doing is just combining them into a single system and then operating it on the moon for a different application rather than what the original plan was. So this electric arc, the idea of using an arc to ablate off charged particles that you can then control with electric and magnetic fields, this is a pulse plasma thruster, for example, which have been around since the 50s or the 60s. You put an electric arc across the surface of a solid propellant block, which is usually Teflon, and it just ablates off Teflon ions. They come off in charged form. So then you can pass them through electromagnetic fields to sort of push them all in this direction and create thrust. Right? So we're not using it to create thrust, but we are creating the ions and then pushing them all in one direction to be collected. The ion optics part, this is something that has also been around for a long time, a very well-known technique that's used all over the place in different size systems. And as I mentioned, it's just a series of electrodes and electric field strengths, varying apertures, and they direct ions into a very collimated ion beam. These are used a lot in manufacturing, focused ion beam sources for precision manufacturing at micron scales. But also, if you're familiar with gridded ion thrusters, the grids at the back of the ion thruster are ion optics. And what you're doing is you are generating a collimated beam of ions all moving at the same velocity in the same direction. Right? So this is just a more narrow beam than what would come out of the back of a gridded ion thruster. And then the magnetic sorting, this is probably the most well-known part of all this. The concept's been used in mass spectrometers, residual gas analyzers for years and decades and whatnot. It's very well known. You just have to have all the particles moving at the same velocity, pass them through a uniform magnetic field, and then it's very easy to predict exactly where they will end up because it's only based on their mass, and elements have very defined masses. So that's the mass spectrometer side. So all of the elements are there. Obviously, they need to be adapted to work in the lunar environment, work in a piecewise series to get them going. But the final step, once we get all that done, is to then put it into the single crawler. I'm calling it a crawler because I think a rover makes it sound too small. It's going to be a bit bigger. When I first came up with this concept, I always had the Jawa sand crawler idea stuck in my head. So the crawler part just kind of stuck. So that's why I keep calling it a crawler. But it would look something like this kind of idea. So obviously it's going to have wheels that can move around on the surface of the moon. Out the front, that ring is going to be a series of 12 electrodes. So you just need 2 for each arc. But if you make it a ring and add more electrodes, you can change the angle of the arc each time, which means you're mining a circular area rather than just a one strip of rectangle, and gives you more lifetime at each location. You can dig more at each point. So it's the ring on the front. Also on the front, there's a little opening, right? Inside the gray part at the front is where your ion optics and your mass sorting elements would be. And then on the back, you can change out the different collection reservoirs based on whatever you're trying to collect at the time. So at the moment, we've just drawn them all as black cylinders. But as I mentioned, the shape of those might change a lot depending on what you're trying to collect. But they would be at the back of the crawler, and they would be interchangeable. So once one of them was full, you could just drop it off at the processing unit, put an empty cylinder back on, and continue driving around and collecting stuff. So little artistic style concept sketch of what this might look like. So you can see the same kind of crawler. It would just be going around in these lunar South Pole craters. We are assuming at the moment it would be using RTGs, like nuclear power sources, so that it could function in the complete shadowed regions of the crater. And it would just move around and it would mine and it would collect. And then they said when the containers get full, it would head off to the processing plant. You can kind of see in the back right. And you drop off the full containers and you pick up empty ones, and then it goes back and it starts moving around the crater again and keeps mining. So that's the general idea of how this might look once we get it operating to the point where we can actually send it to the moon. And if someone wants to go ahead and send it to the moon, of course. So what we're working on right now, it's still very much early stages. We've come up with a general concept. We've got some early preliminary theory numbers. But one of the really big unknowns is the fact that nobody really knows what happens when you put an electric arc across the surface of lunar regolith, because no one's ever tried doing it before. It's actually, for other space missions, it's something you really want to try to avoid doing because arcs might damage your electronics or your system, whereas we are trying to deliberately do it in a controlled manner. So right now in the lab, we have some lunar regolith simulant. We put it in a vacuum chamber to create the low pressures and temperatures that you might see on the surface of the moon. We embed 2 electrodes into the regolith, and then we put a high voltage across them and try to make it arc. And so this is some early tests that we did, and there's the arc. Right. So this is a very small scale test, I should mention as well. These are about an inch apart, right? So it's not a huge scale for the test, but we were able to get the arc. As you can see, we can make it sort of hug the surface of the regolith. And this is the same thing with the lights off, just so you can see the arc a little bit more clearly. Right. We have it very consistent now going across the surface. We can control it quite well. Right, so again, like each time you can see it's just the same place across the surface of the regolith. So we're very excited about that. Right. Here are some still images from that video, just to show how they look like it's the same frame 4 times, but I assure you this is 4 different arcs that we created, just showing how consistent we've been able to get it across and how close we can get it to hugging the surface of the regolith rather than sitting well above it. So that's the arc. Here's, we have like a microscopy camera that we tried to get a little bit closer view of the arcs as well, which really does show how much it's sitting on the surface of the regolith right now. And it's going between the 2 electrodes exactly as we planned. And it looks very consistent again between each arc. So very, very exciting preliminary results for us. The next step, which we're currently working on right now, is to then try to detect what ablated materials are actually coming off when we generate these arcs. And so the results for that should be available towards the end of this year. So stay tuned if you're interested. And we will hopefully be able to tell you what happens when you deliberately put an arc across the surface of lunar regolith, what you get off and what you can then collect from it. So that was it for the presentation today. I just wanted to finish with a shameless plug, because while I've got your attention, why not? I talked a little bit about UTEP and the Aerospace Center at the start. I just wanted to let everybody know that we have 3 new faculty positions open right now to start in fall 2022, looking sort of hypersonics, vehicle design and advanced structures, but any aerospace field would be welcome. So if you know anybody who might be interested in joining us, please let them know and have them apply, or just tell them to contact me and we can work out. Right. So, that's ablative arc mining in a nutshell for you. So ablate regolith with an electric arc, then you can transport it and sort it with electromagnetic fields, which makes it, you can collect multiple elements and volatiles in a single system that's mobile, so you can move around and work on different parts of the moon. So that's the prepared part that I have. And so now, please, if you have questions, I'd love to answer them.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. If anybody has a question, just put your hand up in the room and I can call on you, but we have a few questions that came across in chat. So thank you very much for your presentation. I learned so much. The two questions are kind of related. One is, well, how long would it, I mean, like, what's the rate do you think you'll be able to, you know, collect these types of materials? Like, how long would it take to get, say, a kilogram of water, as an example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, I knew someone was going to ask that, and I thought I'll have those numbers with me, and I forgot. So we're still really not sure on an exact value for that. It's really hard to say because I said we don't have any data whatsoever about what happens when you put an arc across regolith. So what I was basing the original calculations off of was the pulse plasma thruster rates. So the amount of Teflon that gets ejected from a pulse plasma thruster that would be about the same size as this. And based on that, the only number I can remember off the top of my head, and I'm sorry I forgot to bring these with me, but if you want, I'll email them later to you or something, is that we can collect 10,000 tons of water per year with, I think it's about 5 of these constantly operating in the lunar South Pole. That number is what NASA is looking for to get to support lunar settlements. That's a number they think we have to be able to do just for water, which is a big number, right? But that's over a whole year.
And the other question is, how much energy do you think that would take to produce, say, 1 kilogram of water?
Mm-hmm. So I don't have the number, the kilograms, sorry, the amount of power per kilogram of water, say, but we did do some calculations for the amount of power that a single crawler would need. And it is on the order of sort of kilowatts, but that is within the realm of larger nuclear or a set of RTGs or something like that, supplemented with recharge when you can move into the like near the processing plant, which would be in sunlight, right? So you can have batteries and some RTGs and recharge, use the RTGs to keep going a little bit longer. And then I think it was a once per day recharge cycle.
And I kind of have another question, which you sort of addressed, but might be worth asking as well. You talked about some existing technologies here on Earth that kind of led you to creating this design. And maybe it's too early to anticipate this, but do you foresee your research actually feeding back into maybe processes here back on Earth? And how do you think that would look like?
Possibly. I've been keeping that in the back of my mind as we go through, like as we explore lunar mining and we do look at some of these really advanced and sort of out there techniques, could we then bring them back to Earth-based mining, try to change those? So actually my mom works in the mining field down in Australia, actually. So we were having a little bit of a chat about, hey, maybe this arc mining technique could actually be used on the Earth. But the challenge is that it's actually really hard to create an arc in atmospheric pressure because there's just so many particles that you have to try to ionize and move the electrons through. So doing this on the moon actually is a lot easier than being able to do this on the Earth. I don't think this technique would work on the Earth. I think it would only work on the moon in terms of the mining. But yeah, we've had some discussions about it for sure. But I think the mass sorting and the focused ion beams are really highly developed technologies already, but it might help sort of just, they said the only reason I could come up with something like this is because I have worked in electric propulsion before I moved to lunar mining. And it's just that like that diversity of background was the reason that I could develop this idea, or the reason the idea came to me, I should say. And so maybe just getting exposure of these technologies that may not, you know, maybe not too many other lunar mining people knew about focused ion beams, but now they do, right? And so maybe in that regard, it might help just get more exposure in different fields.
There's one comment in the chat room that says, I had no clue that UTEP was so awesome. And And I didn't either. And as you were talking about all the research that you're doing, I was thinking, wow, it'd be so cool to visit in person and take a tour. And I was wondering, is that something that y'all do?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I will also say I had no idea about either El Paso or UTEP before I was invited to go there and look at it. So I understand completely where you're coming from there with that comment. But yes, absolutely. Anyone who wants to come visit and check us out, I can show you where to get really, really great tacos. I can also show you our facilities, show you what we're doing. You can see the ARC in person if you really wanted to. Yeah, just please, anyone who wants to just reach out to me. We're actually open right now, so you don't even have to wait.
Well, I'll have to I get in touch with you and coordinate with the rest of the people here, and you know, maybe we could all take a trip together. It'd be like
That'd be
a
great.
chapter outing.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. We'd love that.
Let's see. Does anybody else have any questions? You know, just raise your hand in the Zoom meeting, and I can call on you. I know for our co-host, you can't actually raise your hand, so I guess if you're a co-host, you can just call it out. And that's really just Greg and Masa.
I was wondering about Mars, where it does have a bit of an atmosphere, so it wouldn't be quite the vacuum. It would have a little more gravity and everything would be slightly different.
Yeah, I've been wondering about Mars as well. And I actually think this would work even better on Mars because there's kind of where you can easily get a plasma arc, it kind of dips. It's a parabolic shape. So atmospheric pressure is like way up this end. And then it dips down to almost actually the pressure of the atmosphere of Mars, like a few torr, like a few hundred Pascal. So that's actually in the really easy to create arcs region. And then the moon, because it is such low atmospheric pressure, it's creeping way up the other side again. So it's actually making it a little bit harder. But because lunar dust is so fine, it actually levitates above the surface. The lunar dust is actually providing a conductive path for the arcs and making it easier. So it kind of brings it back down a little bit as well. But for Mars, I think creating the arcs in the atmosphere would potentially be easier, right? I'd have to look. I haven't really looked into the soil of Mars as much as I've looked into the soil of the moon yet, but I imagine it's still very fine powder and probably very similar constituents. So I think it would work as well. The other one we've been toying with is asteroids. So in our lab at the moment, we have lunar simulant, Mars simulant, and asteroid simulant that we're going to be looking at with the arcs. But right now it's focusing on lunar because that's the NIAC focus. And then after that, we'll move on to Mars and asteroids as well. But in theory, the same concept works because gravity is not a huge, you're controlling everything with electric and magnetic fields. So you don't rely on pressure. You don't rely on gravity at all in this. It's all just electric and magnetic fields that you're setting up yourself. So it should be okay for anywhere else in the solar system, really.
I was also wondering about byproducts, or the things that you don't collect. What happens to them? Do you end up with a lot of little fine dust, or what do you end up with? And where does it go?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one thing that is definitely going to happen. One thing we're definitely going to have to look at is we're arcing essentially in front of the vehicle. And even though most of the arc will come off, hopefully with ablated particles that are charged and we can control them, there is still going to be a lot of dust thrown about during that process as well. And that will end up sticking on the front of the vehicle. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is, yes, you're collecting all sorts of different elements, but maybe you're only trying to actually, you're ablating all sorts of different elements, but maybe you're only trying to collect, say, 6 or 8 of them at a time. And so all the other ones just have to be siphoned off. But again, you can do that with the magnetic field. You just put the collectors in the path of the elements that you want to collect. And then everything else just kind of goes past, or he will hit, like maybe you just have to have a sacrificial surface or something that they just sort of pile up on, and you just sort of dust that off once it gets full. Not quite, you can't just dust off lunar dust, right? But that kind of thing. So Yeah, so that the waste products is something that will need maybe a little bit more thought. Do we just want to basically eject them back into the atmosphere? The moon has an atmosphere, but eject them back into space, or do we
No,
want
actually, I was thinking that maybe, I mean, if your group is not working on that, because previously we were having a proposal with NASA for the very first habitat for moon, and one of the methods that we were a couple of companies that we were proposing was the best method is the sintering to have a pressurized structure. So in this method that you're using, that is somehow the byproduct could be easily used for sintering, because you're actually making the dust, and that dust could go to the cycle of sintering the structure that we want. Because one of the biggest troubles of us was how we can kind of purify or modify the combination of the regolith in our interest, so that we can have the combination of, I don't know, iron, different types of metallic stuff in it, so that it would make the structure more sturdy, and somehow, because of the moonquakes, more flexible towards the exact combination of material that we want. Yeah, I mean, this could be a very good, collaboration and byproduct.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about using them like as more of the just general, like you said, the sintering for the general sort of building materials that don't necessarily need to have really fine impurities or particular makeups. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, it might be the PCV of the future, or at least equivalent, It's like this chemical product that we suddenly, byproduct that we suddenly have so much need and use for. Well, any other questions? Looks like we might have gotten one. Nope. Well, I really appreciate you presenting that. It's really amazing, I was wondering, in terms of having the arc follow on the surface versus some type of mechanical process to pick up the regolith and put it into, it seems like that there's no mechanical aspect to this. It's all electrical and magnetic. Is that correct?
For the most part, yes, like the arc everything is solid state, like the collection side is solid state, the arc itself just is solid state electrodes. But to move the vehicle, you would have to be able to raise the ring of electrodes off the surface so it doesn't get stuck. So the arms on the front of the crawler vehicle are robotic, so they can raise the ring while you're moving and then put it back down on the ground. So there is some moving parts. Obviously the drivetrain is also moving, right? So there are still some moving parts, but not as much as, say, a drill or an OJ dryer that has the rotating screw aspect to it.
That's amazing. Yeah, and a lot of people have commented, awesome presentation, really enjoyed your presentation. Pleasure listening to this. Can't wait to get into the field and help out. So you're definitely inspiring other people to get in here. So
that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody. I also saw someone made a comment about the Command and Conquer Tiberium harvester. So yeah, I guess similarities there too.
Well, if anybody else has a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We did have a question from Malome, actually towards Greig. Wanted to ask Greig about the delay in comms between Mars and Earth, and when building satellites in between to allow relayed communications. Let's see. Let me go back. Yeah. What are the chances that we will have an ISS kind of setup with people living in space more long term? Any companies and institutions planning for that? So, I guess anybody could answer that. Had some thoughts.
Well, you have some companies like Axiom that are planning on building their own space stations and so on. Short term, those would all just be low Earth orbit, but you would think that they would probably want to send those wherever they could. I don't know anybody who's planning on a habitat at a Lagrange point or something. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's talked about in science fiction, but I'm not sure I've really seen that as a on the table kind of a proposal. But I mean, the general assumption is we were generally going to be moving out. We would go to all the obvious places, and certainly places that where we could have a stable orbit are attractive.
Good deal. And I guess in the last few minutes, I just wanted to point everybody's attention to a couple of space events that are coming out. So maybe you'd like to see some of these things real time. Inspiration 4 is actually launching later this month. There's 4 people. Jared Isaacman actually paid for the trip, and he's bringing along a person from St. Jude, who's actually a cancer survivor and works there. And then somebody actually won a drawing back in February for donating to St. Jude's. And then another person used the Shift 4 payment systems that Jared put together to create like an inspirational store. But Dr. Cyan Proctor, of course, is well known in the space community. So it's really exciting to get to see her go. But they're planning to launch on September 14th. They have a 24-hour window. And if you're wanting to get into action a little bit earlier, Netflix is starting a documentary. And the first episode comes out this Monday. So you go over how they got selected, the background of each of those 4 people, and the training that they've been through. So something to see. I think we even have a couple of people going there in person. I think David, I believe you're going there. Is anybody else going to the Cape? Oh, that's going to be kind of exciting to see. The other thing is Rice Space Institute is starting back with their lectures. September 17th is going to be the first one. They're going to try to have a hybrid meeting as well. I believe Rice's campus is, they're currently doing everything virtual. So that may make, I mean, be sure and check out their website, rsi.rice.edu before you drive down to the Rice campus. And then, you know, there's a couple of more people that are presenting each month. The CEO of Intuitive Machines, which is going to be probably the first company to land a private lander on the moon. So that kind of ties in with our conversation today. And Amelia, do you have any type of connections with Intuitive Machines as well, or Astrobotic?
I don't personally know. I'm trying to think if I know anyone at UTEP that does.
Are, I guess, any of the other commercial lunar payload services providers? It just seems like there'd be a nice tie-in between your work and kind of what they're doing.
Yeah.
Well, it'd be great to actually get your process actually operating on the moon at some point. So that'd be really excited about that. Also, September 24th in Tucson, there's a symposium on interstellar space travel. I was actually planning to go to that. So if anybody else is interested in going, it'd be nice to maybe coordinate. So I put a little bit of the agenda there, but they have quite a lot planned, and some tours of Biosphere 2, as well as oh gosh, of some other space companies in the area. And then
I was going to mention one thing about that. They also have a an optional virtual fee that for $50 you can attend at least most of the sessions, I guess, virtually. That I would add, by the way, that for going, it's actually relatively inexpensive for a conference and looked really, really interesting. So even if I can't go personally, I may actually pay the $50 to listen in on the thing.
Yeah, that's another good point. Oh, and one of the space companies you get a tour of is Paragon Space Development Corporation, which actually creates life support systems and was founded by some of the people who were originally part of Biosphere 2. So that's kind of neat. And then next month, we're going to try to do a hybrid meeting. Still working out the details there, but we're going to have Elena Joe talk about the research that she did to write her book, Into the Unknown, Human Exploration in the True Space Age. So we kind of, you know, in the 60s and 70s, we started talking about the space age, and then it seemed like it kind of petered out. But now, you know, we have a lot of energy going again, and you know, maybe this period of time in front of us is the true space age. And I see we have Elena on the call. Did you want to say something?
Hi, everyone. Actually, my voice is kind of going out. I was at a vegan festival this morning and it was very loud. So just saying hi. Not sure what else to say besides I'm really excited to meet everyone in person, hopefully. Yeah, like I can tell everyone's very, very passionate and, you know, intelligent about this topic. So I hope I can like steer the conversation in a way that can add to that. You know, I'm a student in college studying foreign policy. So I feel like there is like kind of like a different perspective that I can add to this conversation. So really excited to share my research and my process with you all.
Well, sounds great. We're definitely looking forward to that. And then just two more events worth noting. October 16th, Observe the Moon Night. If you have any thoughts on what we might do as a chapter to kind of support that, that might be good. We might get a couple of people with telescopes and binoculars and have an event at a park or something. That could be something we could do. And then also in October, we have World Space Week, which is October 4th to October 10th each year. October 4th, 1957, Sputnik 1 was the first human-made object that was put into orbit around the Earth. And then October 10th, 1967 was the signing of the Treaty on Principles governing the activities of states and the exploration and peaceful uses of outer space. So that's kind of the two bookends of that week. So looking to do some activities around that. So anyway, with that, that's pretty much all I had. Anybody else has something they want to share? Let's see, I see Amelia, you had some comments there about the everyone wondering about the power for the ARC system and collection rates. Let's see, early estimates are 10 centimeter arc at 1 Hertz frequency would ablate 131 kilograms of lunar volatiles for collection each year at a continuous power of 75 watts. So there's the specific numbers. It'd be great to see, you know, as you develop your laboratory tests, how that, you know, kind of continues to support those numbers.
Yeah, I'll have updates for you. Those numbers are based on just Teflon. Like I said, it was based on pulse plasma thruster kind capabilities. So yeah, so each like small crawler could do that much, and so you need a few of them to scale up.
Any thoughts on what the smallest system you could make? Like, if you just wanted to prove it out, you know, the volume wasn't really so important, but you just, you know, kind of start doing the.
Well, those numbers, the 10 centimeter arc, I mean, that's really only, that's a very small size anyway. So you'd probably end up with that. If you were just trying to just collect a little bit for trial and error, that could probably be a very small system, like less than 1 cubic meter or even half a cubic meter or something. For sure, that one could be very small, very low power. Yeah, the main systems, it wouldn't be a 10 centimeter arc, it would be like a much bigger arc for sure, or even multiple arcs. So yeah, I think a test system, it could be relatively small. I wonder if we can get it under 200 pounds so that we can put it on our own lunar lander.
Yes,
There you go. Then we just
great.
need to ride to the moon. So yeah, I'll have to get in touch with some of those commercial lunar groups and see if we can get our lander to the moon. And then we're set.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the rates are, but Intuitive Machines says 100 million for their lander. I guess, you know, can they land 200 pounds? Yeah. Well, anybody had anything else they wanted to share?
There was one other conference worth mentioning, and that's right before that IRG conference that you mentioned. There's NIAC, which is the NASA Innovative Program. Amelia is a speaker at that, and that's happening September 21st to 23rd. Now that one is at the same location as this IRG one. If you're going, you might as well go to both. But the other thing, that one is also possible to attend remotely for free. You don't even have to pay any money for that. So that's another option. You can just look it up under NASA 2021 NIAC Symposium. You'll find it pretty quickly.
Yes, everyone should come along for sure. Although I will just note, it's now 100% virtual. Last week they reverted back. They decided because of Delta, it's not worth it. So everyone's attending virtually for that one now. But it's still on and it's still free. And there'll be a whole bunch of really interesting speakers. So yeah, I'm excited for that one.
Yeah, we could definitely send out the links to NIAC and the other events as well. So that'd be good.
The most important one, I think, is IAC, which is in Dubai this year. It's a huge event over there, and lots of people are going, but unfortunately, I can't do it. But it's Biennale. It's Architecture Biennale in Dubai, which they're trying to do space architecture stuff over there. So it's something like a 3-day tour of all the structures that they're proposing. And then after that, there is a 2-day desert mission, and then it's a 1-week conference.
And this is at the end of October, if I remember right.
Yes.
Yeah, I had attended IAC when it was in Guadalajara in 2016. And was like 3 rows away from Elon Musk talking about his interplanetary transportation system. So that's really exciting. Well, good deal. Well, we're just about at 4 o'clock, and doesn't seem like we have any more questions or comments. So maybe we'll just go ahead and wrap it up now, unless somebody else has something. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Amelia. Really appreciate your time, and your presentation is so informative. And I mean, like you said, we've got to figure out how to get the materials out of that regolith into some usable form. So this looked like a way to do it.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I love talking about this kind of stuff. I just love doing this kind of stuff. So thank you.
Yeah. But we enjoyed hearing about it.
Oh, I'm glad.
Yeah, it was really informative. Thank you.
Well, good deal. Well, see everybody October 2nd.
Have a great holidays and weekend. Bye.
Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.